In Parshas Vayishlach, we conclude the journey of Yaakov, our forefather, in terms of his facing the external threats that come from outside of the family. As we noted, he ran from his father's house for his life, escaping his brother Esav. He ran into the clutches of Lavan, his future father-in-law, who cheated him and made life difficult for him. He emerged, tried to return back to the land of Israel, and encountered his brother Esav, and that's this week's Torah reading, the famous encounter with the dream first, where this angel of Esav, the archangel of evil, challenged him throughout the night, and he struggled, and then he faces Esav with his whole family, and then they part company. And seemingly, a major chapter in the development of the Jewish people and the life of Yaakov comes to a conclusion, to such an extent that we'll see next week that Rashi sort of hints at the idea that Jacob himself felt as though he had completed his challenges in life and that it was time for him to retire and to, count his blessings, which was yet not to be. The title of this class is Home Building. And I want to look into the idea of what it means to build a Jewish home, because I think that's the point of the narrative that we're in right now, where Yaakov left, as we described a couple of weeks ago, with nothing, with the clothing on his back, made his way into a challenging world, fraught with danger and risk, came back to encounter his brother Esav, who had overwhelming military might against him, prevailed against the angel, dealt with the challenge of the abduction of his daughter Dinah. And then this parsha concludes recording the death of Yitzchak, his father, and therefore the entire legacy of Abraham and Isaac resting on the shoulders of Jacob, now named Yisrael, and his children, his 12 children. When the definition, if you look up the concept of a home, you find two diametrically opposed ideas. There's an English idea, an English law, which has ramifications in American law too, which is my home is my castle. I create a home so that I can rule over it. I make my own rules. And as we all know from even mortal defense legalities, if someone comes into my home, I have rights to kill that person in self-defense that I don't have outside of my home. So clearly, and we see this in everyday life, people build homes, construct homes to demonstrate their wealth, to show their power, their prestige, in order to feel as though they have a controlling place within the universe, a place that is theirs. A different approach to home building is really, when you look up the idea, it says a home is a place wherein a person lives as a member of a household. It almost sounds redundant, but the implications are vastly different. A member of a household. It implies right away the notion of one person making space for the other person and sharing space and constructing an area of safety, of growth, of love, all the warm, fuzzy ideas we have of a home. And then I included in the notice to this class a quote from Jonathan Sachs, which I'll reduce down to as follows: that Jewish unity, the concept of us being the Jewish people, or as we are referred to as Beit Yisrael, the house of Israel, literally, we say that in the Psalms. It demands that as a Jew, I see myself as a member of an indivisible people. And Rabbi Sachs says, not this group versus that group, not my family versus your family, but the ultimate concept of the house of Israel, the Beit Yisrael, that we strive to construct within the world, is a place where we see ourselves, we act as though we're indivisible as a people, and we're totally committed to one another. And that's the phrase, Kol Yisrael, Arevim Zel Lazel. We're all mutually pledged to one another. Where does this idea come from? So I want to point to something innovative, something I didn't realize that came up in a talk given by Rabbi Chaim Tversky, alluded to it. I spoke to him about it a little bit this morning to clarify it. But if we go back to the beginning of Yaakov's journey, which is on page 144, that parsha of Vayishlach, just to look quickly, you'll see something that's famous, well known, but it has an implication. To make the setting, Jacob's running for his life. He encounters the place where the temple is to be built. He falls asleep, and he awakens, and he declares, it's chapter 28, and we're going to look at sentences 11 and 17. But he wakes up and he makes the pronouncement, Ein zeh ki'im beit Elokim. This is nothing other than the house of God. V'zeh shar hashamayim. And this is the gate of heaven. Now, just noticing the Hebrew here in the sentence, the word zeh is repeated twice. Because it really, in order to be concise, it should simply say, Ein zeh, this is Beit Elokim v'shar hashamayim. It could be contracted into that, but the fact that he's pointing to two different things, he's breaking up the idea of the Beit Elokim, the house of God, and the gate of heaven into two different things. And indeed, he goes on to talk about the idea that the stone, in sentence 17, says, Jacob woke up, he took the stone that he placed under his head as a pillar, poured oil on it, and he named the place Beit Kel, which means house of God. So it was specifically the stone that he rested on. Now, we were taught when we were little kids, and something that Rashi points out, that the words in the Torah are that when he went to sleep that night, he gathered stones in the plural, and he placed them around his head. And when he woke up in the morning, he was surrounded by a stone, which became a pillar. So what do we see there? That stone amalgamated itself into one unified protective barrier in order to protect the future of Jacob, who was sleeping without any defense on the mountain of Hashem. And in fact, that's what it refers to. It says, Ein zeh ki'im beit Elokim. This is nothing other than the house of God. It indicates a sense that a house, by definition, is a place where distinct objects or distinct individuals are molded together, become super connected, become amalgamated, and can become one, or to use the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, we can become an indivisible people. And of course, as Americans, we know one nation under God, indivisible. That's the way we pledge allegiance in the United States. The notion that out of many comes one, which was central to the thinking in the founding of America as well, that becomes the sign, the true sign of a home that a person lives within. So I don't live in my home as an individual together with other people. I don't live in my home as the ruler making the rules and therefore calling the shots or telling others what to do, but rather I live in my home as part of the process of forging an indivisible entity, a family, a community, ultimately the Jewish people. That's the goal of a home. And it's clear that that's what's achieved over these three Torah portions, because Jacob returns back with his new name, Yisrael, conveyed on him first by the angel he opposed, and then ultimately by God directly, which means I have struggled and I have prevailed. And I'm going to put the word prevailed in quotes, because we're going to come back to a medrash a little later, which is going to refine our notion of what it means to prevail in this way. And if we fast forward to the end of this week's Torah reading, Parshat Vayishlach, and we turn to page 178 in the Stone Chumash, what do you see there? You see there, in a certain sense, the conclusion of the dramatic confrontation between Esav and Yaakov and Jacob, Yisrael, that defines this week's Torah reading. And what does it say? If you pick up the narrative on chapter 33, sentence 16, Esav started back that day on his way towards Seir. Vayoshav bayamahu Esav lidarko Seira. And that idea on his way doesn't simply mean he took out his GPS and followed the road signs, but rather Esav returned to his way, his pursuits in life. And we'll see for a moment where the Torah is going to define that. And then what does it say? But Jacob journeyed to Sukkot and built himself a house. Vayiven lo bayit. See, so here we have a parting of the ways. We had a parting of the ways when we initially met Esav. I just want to introduce a medrash here, which we haven't quoted before in this class, which is that Esav, as a young child, was his imagination was captured by the example of Nimrod, of the ruler, the great hunter, Nimrod, who ruled the world, who led the building of the Tower of Bavel. And in fact, it was Nimrod's clothing that Esav wore, and that was worn ultimately by Jacob when he stood before his father Isaac as an impostor. So when it says that Esav continued on his way or went back to his path in life, Esav indeed finds great fulfillment. The final chapter in this week's Torah reading, and it's a long one, it details the genealogy of Esav. And he has rulers and kings and chieftains, Alufei Esav, and Malachim and kings come out of him. So Esav's way bears fruit for Esav. He's not building a home. He's not interested in any containment. He's interested in conquest and being in the field and hunting and capturing and making things his own. And certainly any house that he would be domiciled in would be viewed in the light of, it's his castle. I make the rules here. I'm the king of the castle. And indeed, the Torah goes to great pains, and it's hard to swallow even how successful the vision Esav had in following the guidelines and the path of Nimrod. And indeed, fast forward to 2025, and but according to rabbinic tradition, the whole Christian world and the Western world as we know it are the descendants of Esav. They rule the world. They dominate the world. They have the armies and the weapons and the power, and they dwarf, and they make the rules. They make the rules. So what the Torah here is cluing us in on, in a very dramatic way that we need to confront for our own well-being, is that whereas Jacob is intent to build a home, a place of belonging, a place of growth, a place of development, go right back to the first description of Jacob, Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim. He was a simple, direct person who dwelt within the tent, studying, contemplating, building relationships, giving over a legacy, a rich legacy to children, focused on raising children, which is what he told Esav. The last conversation he had with him was, I can't go along with you in this week's Torah reading because I have young children. I have to care for my children. You're a person of war. You're a person with goals and domination in mind. You go your way and I'll go my way. And the Torah minces no words in chapter 35 here, the whole ending of the Parsha. I'm sorry, chapter 36, I think it is, right? Chapter 36. These are the chronicles of Esav, and it goes on. And we have generations, we have kings, we have rulership, we have all kinds of dominion going on. And there's a phrase in Talmudic ruling that B'derech she'adam rotze leilech molichino. So God opens the gateway to people to follow the path that they truly most deeply want to pursue. So Esav blossoms. Esav is a ruler that we yet know today, casting a shadow over the whole world. Who are we? We are the home builders. We are the ones who are focused on keeping our family together, building connections between one another, showing care for one another, creating places of belonging, protecting a rich legacy that began with Abraham and was passed down to Isaac, and all the fraught tension of the blessings going to Esau, not going to Esau, where they go, where they end up. All those ideas, we're content to be home builders, protecting, developing, and carrying forward that legacy. And that becomes definitive of us as the Jewish people. And that's what the Torah here is literally penciling out for us. That this is the fork in the road that concludes this whole section of the Torah. And I want to tell you, if you remember from the Pesach Haggadah, where we have a section where we quote from the book of Joshua, it's Joshua chapter 24, where we say all this. We say, Vatein le'esav et har seir l'reshet oto. God gave the mountain of Seir a protected, high, mighty perch as Esav's legacy, inheritance. V'Yaakov u'vanav yordu Mitzrayim. Where do we end up? As we'll see over the coming few weeks, we end up enslaved in Egypt. Now, it's a jarring statement to make. It's a jarring moment if we were to stop here and scratch our heads and really wonder deep down, well, would I really rather inherit the legacy of an Esav? Am I happy inheriting the legacy of a Jacob? So the Alshich on these sentences in the book of Joshua says something very profound. It says, why does the book of Joshua emphasize this contrast? And I think it can be used to explain the seemingly jarring end to this week's Parsha. It says, because it has to be clear to us and to the world who are the descendants of Abraham. What does it mean to be a descendant of Abraham? Well, we have this initial prophetic vision that Abraham had at the covenant between the parts. Yodea Teda, you should know with certainty that your children will go down to a strange place. They will be enslaved. They will face great travail and difficulty. And then they will ultimately emerge from that galvanized as a people. And the Asher points out that we don't have to worry about Yishmael as a competitor for us, although today that is an issue. But he said because Yishmael had a different mother. He wasn't descendant from Sarah. He was only descendant from Abraham and his mother Hagar. And therefore, the sense of him perhaps having an opportunity to share our spiritual legacy is not so clear. It's clear that he doesn't. But Esav, who was born from the same mother and father as Jacob was, the Torah and the circumstances of life and the giving of the blessings and all the travail that Jacob goes through up until this point is all orchestrated by God to make it crystal clear that inheriting the legacy of Abraham is not a cakewalk. It's not a simple life. It involves different goals, different aspirations, a different orientation towards spirituality rather than dominion over the physical world. And in order to make that crystal clear, the Alshich says that's why Joshua, in his prophetic statement there, contrasts Esau inheriting the mountain of Seir with us, the Jewish people, going down to Egypt. And I dare extend it to the chapters 34, 35, 36 in this week's Torah reading to say that Torah is really doing the same thing. And we have every room to be proud of that. And I want to play this out in an interesting way. I happened to encounter some writings of the Chavetz Chaim in a sefer called Shem Olam. And he comments on a sentence in Proverbs, which is pretty well known. The sentence in Proverbs says, if you want to know and understand Yirat Hashem, reverence of God, fear of God, connection to God, you have to seek it in Tivakshena kekesev uchem matmonim. You have to seek after it the way people seek after silver and after pearls or after gems. That you have to have that fire in your belly. You have to have that level of inspiration. We know people work very hard to amass wealth, to get a leg up in the world. We need to find within ourselves that type of pursuit when it comes to spirituality. And the Chofetz Chaim, in a very interesting way, says, pause at this for a moment. Think about it. Why do people pursue silver, wealth? What are their goals? So he says, typically it applies to three areas of life: the food you eat, the clothing you wear, and the home you build. That's where this overlaps with the theme of this class. So what does the Chofetz Chaim say? The Chofetz Chaim says, so we're a people, we're an eternal people. We're looking at eternity. So he says, what food lasts eternally? There's no such thing. Food spoils. You have to grow, plant, harvest, do it again and again. You have to raise animals, slaughter them, eat what you want, promulgate those species. He says, but when it comes to food and clothing the same way, if you're looking at a spiritual food and spiritual clothing, you have to be talking about the performance of the mitzvot that God gave us, which create an eternal source of spiritual sustenance for the person. And you have to think about the Torah, which clothes us in the wisdom and understanding that enables us to stand before God. And he alludes, again, very Kabbalistically, to the idea that Adam and Eve, after they ate from the tree they weren't supposed to eat from, they felt naked. What does it mean they felt naked? God created them. The idea was they realized that they no longer had the human dignity. They hadn't created that sense of self-worth and self-respect so that they could stand before God without embarrassment. So in a very interesting way, in a very allegorical way, the Chofetz Chaim is saying, and in the same way when it comes to a house can be impressive. It can be many thousands of square feet. It can be built in a prestige location. It can have a wonderful view. So, but we know no such house lasts forever. It says, but a home that can be built forever, just to follow this analogy, this allegory out that the Chofetz Chaim is creating, such a home is built on the relationships and the morasha kehilat Yaakov, the legacy, the spiritual legacy, the values, the connection parent to child that we forge within our homes. So the Chofetz Chaim says in a very beautiful way that yes, when we seek connection to God and to eternity, when we pursue it like people pursue silver and wealth and prestige, we pursue it in the same way. We worry about our food, the quality of our mitzvot, and our opportunities to be of service to Hashem and to our fellow man. We look at our clothing, our development of human dignity and self-respect and self-worth. And then we look at our homes, the level to which we can create indivisible units of family, community, and peoplehood, which really carry through. And I want to just build off of this allegory that the Chofetz Chaim does with a third source. It's in Medrash Rabbah, number 63.9, and I was given recently a very beautiful discussion of this Medrash by Rabbi Michal Tversky, a class he gave in 2020, 5 years ago, at this time of the year. Let me read the Medrash first. The Medrash is as follows. Time of the Romans ruling over the Jewish people. And the Roman ruler went to one of the great rabbis, nobody's named here in specific, and asked him a question. He said, who is going to succeed our empire and kingdom after the Roman rulership ends? A very loaded question, because if you're the subject and the emperor's general stands before you with his soldiers and their swords sharpened and ready to be used, and they ask you a question, what the succession, what do you see in the future? Because after all, we acknowledge, he's saying on behalf of the Romans, that our empire can't last forever. Now, according to Jewish sources, we talk about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. From a Jewish perspective, the Roman Empire has not fallen. It still continues. But he wants to know, what do you see in the future? So the sage did something remarkable. It says the sage took out a clean sheet of paper, took out a fresh pen, and wrote on it words from the beginning of the conflict between Esav and Yaakov, Esau and Jacob. And he wrote the words, V'yodo ochezet be'akev achiv. His hand remains holding on to the heel of his brother. And he doesn't say anything further. And obviously you could take this in many different ways. But what it indicates, and it requires thought and reflection, and we're coming to the end of our allocated time span here. And I really would recommend, if you can get a copy of Rabbi Twersky's class titled Dragging Us to Mashiach, it indicates something, that to the extent that we cling to who we are and the position that God places us in the world, we can be certain that although all empires will come to an end, and they do come and go, as Mark Twain comments, although nothing in the world is physically eternal, we can be sure that at the end of days, we, the Jewish people, will remain steadfast in clinging to the heel of our brother Esav, in the sense that we are ready for the time when his dominion will come to an end, and when, therefore, the spiritual values of the world will blossom forward. And indeed, I just want to make reference to something Rabbi Usher Weiss, in preparing for Hanukkah, stresses an idea over and over again. If you look at what the Greeks did in the temple, and we sing about it in Moasor, Upartsu Chomos Migdalai, they punched holes in the walls of our temple. Where did they punch holes in? Does anybody know? The temple functioned. Offerings were made every day. They had idols, whatever else they put into the temple, but the temple functioned throughout the Greek oppression, throughout the wars of the Maccabees. They had no idea of burning down the temple or destroying it like the Romans did eventually. They liked having the temple there. But what they did is they punched holes in a wall. What wall did they punch a hole in? And we know by tradition it's the cheo. It's a small little wall which demarcates the area in the temple to which non-Jews are welcome to come in and worship God and make offerings. And then there was a barrier beyond which only Jewish people could go. And he says, so what's the whole sense of our resistance on Hanukkah? The sense of our resistance on Hanukkah was our pride in the unique position of the Jewish people, the unique legacy of the Jewish people within God's world. So we are, and we should always see ourselves as constructive, active builders of homes. That's why going to weddings is such a beautiful moment in the Jewish people. That's why they're celebrated so much. Yizkud livnot bayit ne'eman b'Yisrael. Yet another home is being built. Sometimes people ask me, how big is your home? And I remember at a certain point when I had several married children, I quickly took out a piece of paper and I added up the square footage of my home and this kid's home and that kid's home and that kid's home and that kid's home. And I gave them an outstanding number. I said, wow, you live in such a big house. I said, yeah, it's not all in one place. Part of the house is in one state and part of the house is in another state and part of the house is in another country even, but it's all one house. It's all interconnected, and it's all an outgrowth of the connection and the fervor with which we formed a family unit and which we connected ourselves to the community. And I think in that sense, the title of Rabbi Michal Torsa's class, Dragging Us to Mashiach, we're dragging along, we're holding tight to Esav's heel, just as we came into the world, so to speak, in that position, proud of our position, secure in our values, and steadfast in the knowledge that our hand is not the upper hand much of the time, but our hand is the enduring, building, constructing hand that makes life worthwhile. And to the extent that we can do that, we are truly and really fulfilling everything that God wants the Jewish people to be.